Mythology. Stories that contain larger-than-life gods and goddesses watching over our tiny civilization. Stories that stretch the boundaries of our imagination while explaining why things are the way they are. For either the Greeks or Romans or the Americas, mythology was the binding belief that made humans seem as one. For the Greek myths of Narcissus, Hyacinth, Adonis, and Pygmalion, they contain important messages about death and resurrection that earned them the name the flower myths. These moral messages are still followed to this day.
One major character in Greek mythology that represents the idea of death and resurrection is Narcissus. After Narcissus' death, a new flower developed which has many bulbs and is very colorful and fragrant. These details of this flower personify the actual characteristics of Narcissus himself. Both were beautiful and well-liked. As Narcissus died and resurrected in the form of a flower, it clarified that there was an afterlife, and his faulty characteristics would be passed down through many generations. The myth of Narcissus is somewhat complicated. He was loved and adored by many women, but refused to like any of them in the same manner. One of his admirers was a nymph named Echo, but she was cursed by Hera only to be able to copy the words of the other person in a conversation. She ended up losing her opportunity with Narcissus, and she went and hid in a cave to hide her shame. One day, Narcissus was thirsty and went to a nearby lake to get a drink. There, he saw his reflection and immediately fell in love with himself. The name Narcissus originated from his act of being narcissistic towards himself. He felt that he couldn't live without looking at his reflection, so he fell into the lake and killed himself. Afterward, a new flower had sprouted from his body, and this flower came to be called Narcissus. The idea of death and resurrection is shown here, as he died, but his faults are remembered due to the birth of the Narcissus flower. Another flower myth that portrays this idea is that of Hyacinth. Similarly to the death of Narcissus, the end of Hyacinth resulted in the existence of a deep purple and lily-shaped flower. The flower that sprouted after the deceased hero was his resurrection. By looking at the type of flower, it embodied and represented who Hyacinth was. The flower Hyacinth is known to be beautiful just as the hero was when he died in his youth. Not only was the flower a symbol of Hyacinth in life, but the fact that the perennial grew out of the blood of the dying hero shows his transformation into another being. With Hyacinth's blood flowing throughout the nature of a new existence, it shows that he is present. Hyacinth perished to the hands of his most beloved friend Apollo in a friendly competition. As each began to try to outlast the other by seeing who could throw a discus the farthest, Hyacinth's forehead met the hard metal discus, instantly killing him. Apollo was devastated by what happened because his intentions were far from malicious. Apollo then inscribed the initials of his dearest friend on the flower. In a different variation of the myth, the deprivation of Hyacinth was caused by Zephyr, the god of the west wind. Because of the jealousy of the unshakable relationship between Apollo and Hyacinth, he blew the discus to cause a fatal strike. Nevertheless, both variations mention the flower that resulted in the passing of Hyacinth. As he perished innocent, the resurrection of Hyacinth was transformed into an everlasting being. Of all the flower myths, that of Adonis is the most infamous. Adonis was loved by the goddess of love, Aphrodite, but also by the queen of the underworld, Persephone. Since both goddesses were unwilling to compromise, Zeus concluded that Adonis would stay with Persephone during the autumn and winter months, and spend the spring and summer with Aphrodite. Whenever Adonis was with the goddess of love, she wished only to please him. During his stay, Adonis would hunt in the woods, and Aphrodite would watch him from above in the sky. One unfortunate day, Adonis tracked down a wild boar and attempted to kill it, but he was unsuccessful, and the animal charged him, and it resulted in his death. Aphrodite flew to the sound of her lover's groan and watched as he bled to death, kissing him as he died. In the underworld where Adonis then resided, he could not hear them nor see the crimson flower that bloomed where his blood had stained the earth. Annually, around the anniversary of his tragic death, the red anemone flower blooms and springs up. As Adonis was sent to the underworld, this magnificent flower sprouted at the place where his body lay. This beautiful symbolic plant rose from the spot of a tragedy and was fed by the blood that ran from Adonis's body. The blood from his body served as if it were water, growing the flowers and turning this dreadful event into something beautiful. The yearly resurrection of this red anemone wildflower acts as a reminder of the life and death of Adonis, which is awful to contemplate, but it gives something beautiful to replace the mournful atmosphere. The myth of Pygmalion is another story of Greek mythology that follows the idea of resurrection. Pygmalion was a sculptor that was known for his detest of women. Despite his qualms against them, he sought to sculpt one to form the perfect woman without the deficiencies he looked down on. When his masterpiece was complete, he created a lifelike figure that was more beautiful than any other woman or statue that came before it. He fell in love with his statue and treated her like a lover would. Venus noticed his passion for the figure and decided to help Pygmalion. She gave his statue life when he came to a feast dedicated to Venus. Pygmalion was able to be with the statue he loved that was known as Galata. This myth follows the idea of resurrection because life was given to the statue Galata. The goddess Venus was able to grant life to the icon because she was interested in new kinds of lovers. Pygmalion initially hated the thought of women, but over time began to love the one he sought to create. He fell passionately in love with his creation and overcame his disdain for women. The resurrection of Galata, in turn, altered the personality of Pygmalion. He was able to alter his hatred for women into appreciation through his creation of his version of the perfect woman. His sculpture allowed him to overcome his hatred because he was exposing himself to women for an extended time while he perfected Galata.